So welcome to the podcast. Today's guest is Kristian Niemietz, who is head of political economy at the Institute of Economic Affairs. We've also had Mark Littlewood who's heading the institute in an earlier podcast. We'll link to that. Kristian Niemietz has studied economics at the Humboldt University in Berlin. He's German, and at the University of Salamanca. I love that word. It's a great word, Salamanca. And he's also studied political economy at King's College London. Kristian previously worked at the Berlin-based Institute for Free Enterprise and taught economics at King's College London. He's authored several books. His latest, and a great book it is Socialism, the idea that never dies. We are doing this podcast to discuss some of the topics in this fantastic book, and can highly recommend it. We'll link to it in show notes. With the specific reason, it's up to date, so to speak, to discuss it right now, because there's currently a debate in Denmark. Several books have come out, and there's a discussion. There's this book by a Marxist, Søren Maus, who, by the way, I invited him to discuss the book with me at this podcast, but he declined and said he couldn't see how that could promote an anti-capitalist agenda. So I assume he meant that he would lose that debate, which is kind of interesting. He decided not to take part, but that doesn't mean we can't discuss his book. And if he reconsiders, he's still invited to join me for a debate about Marxism and his book at some point. And there's another book by this guy who's a Danish former politician, probably politician again after the next election, I assume, Pelle Dragsted, called Nordic Socialism, Nordic Socialisme. He's been on the podcast, so we'll link to that show. And what he and many others are arguing right now, Kristian, is that they want a completely different kind of socialism from all the other types of socialism that have ever been tried. They want a democratic socialism, something that is not at all authoritarian, and so that's going to be a completely different story. Now, you argue in the book that was always the intention of all the socialists' revolutions, all the socialist failed attempts. It was always the intention to create a bottom-up democratic socialism. How many failed attempts of socialism have there been?
Well, that depends on how you count it. There have been about 24, I would say. There's been the whole Eastern Bloc, and there have been several in Africa. There has been Mozambique, Angola, Zimbabwe, arguably. And of course, Cuba, North Korea, more recently Venezuela, Nicaragua. If you add them all up, you get something like 24 of those.
Okay, so 25 or so.
Yeah, not counting the very short-lived ones. There have been those like in Chile in the early 70s, or even there were some that lasted only a couple of weeks or months. There has, of course, been. You could start with the Paris Commune if you wanted to.
Yeah, good point.
Or with Catalonia during the Spanish Civil War. Even the Bavarian Soviet Republic just after the First World War. There have been a couple of those very short-lived ones. I'm discounting those, but the ones that lasted for 3 years or longer, there's about 24 of those, all ending in varying degrees of failure. So, of course, your authors would say, oh no, our version of socialism is totally different from anything that's ever come under that name before, because everything that has ever come under that name has been horrible. So, of course, they have to distance themselves from all the real-world examples in order to keep their idea popular. Unfortunately, they're very good at it.
Yeah, either they're very good at it, or it is there is something very appealing or persuasive about the idea of socialism that means that they don't even have to be particularly good at it. But maybe we can discuss that at the end. It's hard to tell if it's one or the other, isn't it?
Yeah, it's probably a mix of the two.
Yeah. Anyway, let's start out. So you have in your book you run through quite carefully. Obviously, you you could write several books on all of these different cases, but you have quite a lot of detail about each individual failed attempt to create a socialist society, and you go through the USSR, China, Cuba, North Korea, Cambodia, Albania, the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, and Venezuela. Mm-hmm. And then you mentioned some others as well along the way, but those are the sort of the main ones. So that you go through. So let's start out with the USSR. Is it really true that that was also an attempt to create a democratic socialism?
Yes, it was. That is one of the mistakes that today's socialists make. The way they tell their story is usually they would say, look, it all started with Marx and Engels, and they had this wonderful idea of a worker-run democratic socialism, bottom up, no hierarchies, everything nice and cuddly. And then the bad guys like Lenin came along and perverted those ideas, turned it into something autocratic, technocratic, totalitarian, top-down. But that is absolutely not true. That is, of course, how the Soviet Union ended up, but that's not because it was intended to be that way. It's not that they came up with a reinterpretation somehow of Marxism that was completely at odds with what Marx and Engels would have said. Rather, Lenin wrote a book just before the Russian Revolution in which he described his idea of what the future Soviet society would look like. And it doesn't sound totalitarian at all. It does not at all sound like what it would really be like. It sounds like a workers' democracy. So the young Lenin, the Lenin before he was in power, sounded just like any of the socialists today, whether they call themselves Nordic socialists or millennial socialists or democratic socialists, socialists of the 21st century. The pre-revolution Lenin sounded just like that. And the way he described it is, he thought of the capitalists as a ruling class, a bit almost like slave owners. And he thought you just have to chase these people away and the rest will sort itself out. Then the workers will take over. The workers take over the factories, organize themselves democratically in Soviets. That's the workers' councils. That's of course where that word comes from. And the economy would
so the very word Soviet, the very word Soviet actually means a democratically in brackets run company. Is that correct?
Not the company, but a workers' council.
Oh, a workers' council. Okay,
that's what it means. So a Soviet republic literally means a council republic. Yeah.
So that's this bottom-up idea that yes. you get the workers to run things.
Yes, that was always the idea, and that was including Lenin's idea. I mean, Lenin today is associated with this idea of vanguardism, the idea that you have an educated elite that propels the revolution. And yes, he did talk about a vanguard. He did not think that the workers would spontaneously develop class consciousness. That's true. He did see a role for people like himself in a role as educators. But
we all see a role for ourselves, don't we?
Yeah, but he did not see himself as a future dictator or something like that. The educated elite in Lenin's view of the world, their role would not be to run the socialist society after the revolution. They would merely act like a teacher. They teach the working class about Marxism and class consciousness, and maybe they kickstart the revolution. But the idea was that once the revolution is in motion, once he's got the ball rolling, those people can just retire, or they might have a symbolic role. But he did not believe that these people would become the new ruling class in the new society. That's the way it turned out, because it then turned out that once you take away market mechanisms, you take away capitalist ownership patterns, the economy doesn't spontaneously run itself. You then get total chaos, and the only way out then is the sort of top-down system that the Soviet Union then became. But that was not the idea. They really thought they start the revolution, and then the workers take over from there. And then the idea was that they, the educated elite, could then lean back, take a step back and say, okay, our job is done here. Over to you, the workers.
There's a great quote by Lenin. I think I got it from Thomas Sowell originally, where Lenin writes about, running a company and saying, that's really very simple. That's just, you just need to understand basic arithmetic, and then you can do that. Yes. So we can let the workers, we just have to get the workers who can, read and write and count, and they can do that. And then they tried that, and of course they went completely wrong. But it's because it's actually very hard to run a company, and you need to be really willing to run risk, invest money, and hope that it's going to be a successful investment. If for many it's not, etc. So all these character traits that you need for a successful entrepreneur, that's simply not there if you just hand over the company to people who don't have that skill or that inclination. And Lenin was then, so what you're saying is that he was then facing a situation where things were turning into chaos. I guess also because he didn't have markets and prices anymore.
Yes, precisely because of that. Yes, yeah. You can, of course, in principle, you can have an individual company run democratically by workers. I mean, there is the business model of the cooperative, and there are a couple of successful examples of that. You can have that in a capitalist economy. Absolutely nothing wrong with that.
Sure, but they don't seem to be spreading. I mean, you have some, and some can be successful, but it is not the dominant type of ownership in a free market economy, and that gives us some information about it, doesn't it?
Yes, precisely. It works when it's self-selected. If the people who enter that type of company are the ones who fit in well and who want to be involved in the decision making. But of course, not everyone is like that, and nor is there anything wrong with it. There's nothing wrong with having an attitude of I want to do my job. I want to get on with what I'm good at. I don't want to sit in meetings. I don't want to deal with administrative and management stuff. Yeah. For a worker cooperative to work, you need people who do want to get involved in those things, and some people are. And if those are the ones who then go into the cooperative sector, then fine. Of course, that option should exist for them. But you're exactly right. That's I remember that passage as well in Lenin, where he said, "It's all super easy. Don't worry about it. All you need is a few people who can read and write, and some basic calculation. That's all it takes." And that's exactly the reason why he didn't go into great detail, spelling out how that future economy would be run, because he simply thought it wouldn't be necessary. Yeah,
and it's very interesting that Thomas Piketty has the same kind of attitude in his latest book, where he talks about he doesn't want to get rid of private ownership. He just wants to circulate it, and he wants to circulate it by increasing by creating a wealth tax of 90% or something like that. Obviously, you will circulate private ownership quite a lot if you have a wealth tax of 90%. And then he says, and that's no problem, because there's no reason to believe that the current owners of the capital are better at taking care of it than anyone else would be. That's exactly the same type of attitude or idea.
Well, in watered down format, I guess there would still be a role in Piketty for entrepreneurship of sorts. That's something that the old school socialists or the newer socialists completely lack. They imagine the capital.
It's not much watered down, though, is it?
Well, yeah, but he's still.
I take your point.
He's not a complete anti-capitalist. He's just obsessed with this inequality stuff. He thinks that capitalism will lead to ever greater concentration of capital ownership and inequality. So I guess he would even consider himself as someone who tries to save capitalism from itself. I suppose if you had him on the show and called him an anti-capitalist, he would probably reject that label. Whereas the classical, the more traditional socialists, they really did imagine an entrepreneur to be just the equivalent of an aristocratic landowner. The landowner in the Middle Ages, of course, doesn't add anything to the value. They don't till the fields. They don't really produce anything. They just sit in their castle and own stuff and get rich in that way. And Marxists have always imagined that is what entrepreneurs under capitalism are also like. They don't really do anything. They just sit there and own.
I never. That's interesting. Yeah, if you try to understand capitalism at an age where you're still very close to feudalism, I can see why you would get that idea about the capitalists. Yes, sure. Interesting.
Yeah,
sorry, go on.
That must have been it for Marx, that he just saw a parallel between the aristocratic landowner, who of course in his time still existed. It's not that they suddenly disappeared and then you had capitalism. And he must have thought that someone who owns a factory is just like that. And of course, if the whole aristocracy had suddenly just disappeared, the peasants in the Middle Ages could still have carried on doing their business and on a day-to-day basis in whatever way they were doing it, because they weren't helped actively by the feudal landowner. And that is how Marxists imagined socialist revolution to be like as well, that you have this whole class of completely unproductive people. They don't add anything. They just exploit everyone. They just sit there and collect the profits. And if you imagine capitalists to be just a class of parasites, then of course you will think it's going to be super easy to organize an economy without them. It's only when you actually try to do it, that's when you start to realize, oh no, it isn't quite so easy. That's what happened after the Russian Revolution, that once you had all these mass expropriations and the elimination of market mechanisms, you had a complete collapse of the economy. Of course, the Civil War didn't help, but I guess it would have happened either way. And that's when they started to organize it in this military fashion.
And then what happens? You've alluded to it. Then you get chaos, and how does that turn into authoritarianism?
Well, because then you have to do something. You have to organize your economy in some way. Once you notice that it doesn't just spontaneously organize itself. Of course, that's what happens in a market economy. There, you don't need anyone in charge of running it. But that's because you have other mechanisms. You have, in particular, the price mechanism that just coordinates activity. Once you take that away, there is initially nothing left, and then something has to fill that gap, because otherwise the regime won't last. And what has always filled the gap is command and control.
Yeah. And you can still be a sort of good intentioned Lenin or Stalin, and have to do that, can't you? Because you're looking at an economy that is no longer functioning. You don't have prices, you don't have markets, you don't have competent business leaders. The workers seem unable to run it. Then you start assuming that they're sabotaging, and you might still just be good intentioned and concerned about how do we get the economy to work? We need production, otherwise people will starve, and there'll be nothing for people to consume. And then you step in.
Yes, yeah, I don't believe that these were all just bad people. It would be an amazing coincidence that in all of these cases, you just end up somehow with a bad person on top. What happens, of course, is that there will be some more romantic idealists who then just get pushed aside because they don't know what to do in a situation of chaos, and the more ruthless ones will then be the ones who actively make decisions and say, no, this is the way it has to be done. And
that's what Hayek argued.
Yes,
the road to serfdom.
On top, yes. Yeah. And that would explain Stalin figures, but you could take them out of the equation altogether. And in fact, it was predicted. There was a book written in the 1890s by a German liberal, Eugen Richter. It was called Pictures of the Socialistic Future. So this was a quarter century before the Russian Revolution. He described a future socialist society, and it sounds suspiciously like the Soviet Union or any Eastern Bloc society. He predicted that it would turn out to be tyrannical, even though he did not have any bad characters in that book. It's a novel set in a hypothetical future, but there is no Stalin-like character. There are no baddies in that book. There are the socialist leaders in his book are all well-intentioned people, but they have to organize their society in a militaristic fashion, because otherwise it just will not be organized at all. And that's how that emerges. So he saw it all coming, even though he didn't have the chance to ever see it in practice. He died long before the Russian Revolution, but nonetheless predicted it quite accurately, to the extent that he even describes a border which sounds suspiciously like the Berlin Wall. It's almost as if he had briefly traveled into the future, caught a glimpse of it, but just not enough to remember any details, then traveled back to his day and to his time and the 1890s and wrote it up. Okay, the details a bit confused, but pretty much saw it coming. And that's the liberal critique. Liberals saw this coming right from the start, long before they knew about Lenin or Stalin.
You've got a science fiction movie there. The manuscript for a science fiction movie with time travel and everything. That kind of thing is fascinating and it's impressive. You know, it's almost it sort of reminds me a little bit of you know, the predictions of Einstein about light bending, and then we actually observe that many years later in the universe. That's impressive. That's really impressive. So okay, so there's a theoretical explanation why we would expect authoritarian. First of all, we would expect it not to work from an economic perspective, but we would also expect it to turn into authoritarianism from a theoretical point of view. And that's been described also by Hayek in The Road to Serfdom, which was, of course, later than the Soviet Union, but before some of these experiments. That's theory. What does the empirical evidence tell us then, if you run through some of these cases?
Backs it up exactly like that. That's exactly what happened, because Hayek wrote this in the early 1940s. So yes, the Soviet Union was around, but none of the others. At that time, it would still have been plausible to say, maybe it's just the Soviet Union. Maybe they just did it wrong, but next time it will be totally.
Yeah, they were very unlucky to get Stalin or something like that.
Yeah, or the starting conditions, and all that. That's there were of course people making that case. Trotsky being probably the first one, and that's he wasn't popular during his lifetime, but that's what later became Trotskyism. The idea that you just had a degeneration of the revolution and a betrayal, and that you had this bureaucratic caste taking over and disempowering the workers, and that's also in George Orwell in Animal Farm. came out just after, I think, The Road to Serfdom, so about the same time, where that is still also the idea that it just got corrupted. Started, the idea was great. You just end up somehow with the wrong people in charge, or in Animal Farm, the wrong animals in charge. And but it would be George Orwell would have had a hard time explaining why it then happened again and again and again and again and again. Imagine what would a sequel to Animal Farm look like that somehow tried to describe the Cuban Revolution or the Chinese Revolution or the North Korean regime. You would have to have dozens of farms in the neighborhood where they have the exact same kind of revolution, and they always say, but we will not end up like Animal Farm, we'll do it better. And then you always somehow have a ruling class of pigs ending up in charge of everything. He wouldn't have a mechanism to explain that. In his case, it's all still very much about how, well, if you kept if the other animals had been more vigilant, and if they had stuck to their original democratic principles, then it would have turned out completely differently. And that's where Hayek's Road to Serfdom is so superior, that he would have expected every other socialist experiment to also look suspiciously like the Soviet Union at some point. And that is exactly what happened, and that's what's still happening today. The latest example is Venezuela, where it took longer, started with democratic elections. Hugo Chavez was in a completely legitimate way, a democratically elected president several times, won referendums. His party won parliamentary majorities, completely regular democratic processes there. It's not that they started with a violent revolution, but it's still ended up in a dictatorship, even though that's what nobody there wanted. And the early Chavez specifically talked about for years how he did never want to be like the Soviet Union. And I think even distanced himself a bit from Cuba, even though they were always buddies, him and Fidel Castro, but he still said, okay, the Cuban Revolution, they're great, they're our allies, but we don't want to be exactly like them. We will
and they were in a specific situation, and that was a long time ago, and now it's different and all that. Yes.
But yeah, it keeps reoccurring, so empirically it's crystal clear.
So is it also, does it also keep reoccurring in the way that they try to create this bottom-up, we will have the workers run, are they all creating cooperatives and, letting the workers run things, or, to what extent are the patterns similar in the ways they try to create a socialist society?
Okay, that can look very differently depending on what example you look at. In the Venezuelan case, yes, there was very much an emphasis on cooperatives. It's just that at some point, they realized that you can set up lots of cooperatives. They subsidize them with oil money, so very easy. If you have, as long as you have the oil money coming in, you can subsidize whatever you like. If that's a cooperative, then that's that. But at some point, Chavez himself fell out of love with them because he realized that those cooperatives, even the ones that worked okay, were just a different form of a capitalist enterprise. He had the idea that they would somehow be a springboard to socialism. You start with cooperatives, you somehow get to socialism. The details to be confirmed. Nobody quite knows what that interim step was supposed to look like, but the idea was lots of cooperatives first, socialism later, something magical happens in between, except nothing magical ever happened. And that's why he then fell out of love with the cooperatives. And that's, there were, I think, other...
So what did he do then?
Well, just went for straightforward nationalization again. The cooperatives are still around, but they just gave up the hope that would be a way of running the entire economy, that would somehow create a next step of democratically planning the entire economy. That's just never happened. You can have a well-run cooperative that runs itself democratically, but the question is, but that would still be a market economy. Then you just have a new form of capitalist enterprise. It doesn't lead to democratic planning of the economy as a whole. And that was always the promise. that somehow you would do away with markets and plan the economy in a democratic way. And that's the step that never happens, whether it's with cooperatives or not. Some just did away with that entirely, didn't even bother with that. In the case of Maoism, they thought the whole problem was that party elites would get corrupt, and that's why you have the Cultural Revolution, where you tell people to constantly denounce each other and keep an eye on each other. And he thought that's where the rot would come from, and that's what had gone wrong in the Soviet Union, that you just have people losing their idealism and or losing the right convictions, and that's why you needed this constant vigilance. And that would be the way to make it bottom up, have people watching their bosses and denounce them, saying this person has revisionist, impure thoughts, and therefore they need a struggle session where we need to exercise those impure thoughts. So it's been done in several ways, but there has always been the idea that the working class should somehow democratically organize itself.
Okay, well, sorry to interrupt, but just to be fair to this guy then, Pelle Dragsted and his Nordic Socialism, Nordic Socialism, he is actually different from what you just described in Venezuela, in that he wants to so-called democratize, to me that is means just expropriate private business, and hand it over to workers, but he doesn't want to do away with markets.
Okay.
He wants these different worker-run companies to compete in markets. He wants to have prices. He doesn't write too much about that, but I think he also wants international trade. Mm-hmm. Although but what I'm pretty sure is going to happen if you do that is that these worker-run businesses will run into a situation where in other countries you have innovative markets, profit and loss driven societies where there's a lot of innovation, new technology, things change, and these businesses, they will need to adapt to that. They will need to invest. They will need to run risk. And why should workers do that? Why should they? If you're a worker and you get your salary from a business, and you also suddenly you are an owner of the business, if it goes bust, you will not only lose your salary, you will also lose the fortune, the wealth you have as an owner of the business. Suddenly you have all the eggs in one basket. And why would workers want that? So when there's a situation, when there's a situation where you need to invest, where would they get money for investment? The workers wouldn't go back home and take a loan out, a mortgage out in their house and bring that money in and say, okay, I'll put even more eggs into the same basket. But they wouldn't do that. So there'd be starved for capital, and then the state would have to step in. So you would get a de facto nationalization in the long run. Don't you think?
Sounds very much like that. I have to say, I don't know that particular author.
No, I know. I mentioned him, and maybe that was my mistake.
Yeah.
But
not a mistake. Not a mistake at all.
Just to be fair to him.
No, I just want to make clear, in case I'm mischaracterizing him, I don't know in that particular case, but from what you're telling me, it sounds to me like he's a market socialist.
Yeah.
So that would be the model of Yugoslavia, the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. They were they exited, they left the Soviet bloc because they had this different model that they wanted it to do in that way, rather than have 5-year plans, have prices, have companies being able to set their own production targets internally and compete in a market. And as far as socialism goes, that's probably the least bad model. Yugoslavia had some modest levels of prosperity. It was, even though they started very poor, but it seemed to work for a while. So if I had to live under socialism? If somebody put a gun to my head and said, okay, I'm dragging you into a time machine, you have to choose a socialist society. It can't be Western, but you can choose which. It would probably be that one. I'd prefer, if it had to be socialism, then let it be market socialism. But even Yugoslavia collapsed eventually, and and I just don't see the appeal. What it really is, yes, you still have a market economy of sorts, but you force one single legal model of a company on everyone. And as you said, not everyone wants to do that. You do force workers to become entrepreneurs, small scale co-entrepreneurs. You can't just work somewhere. You have to become an owner. You sort of have to buy your way into a company. You can't just tell someone, I want to work for you for a couple of hours per week, but I don't want to get involved with the risk of running that business. Whether that is a sound idea or not, I don't know. I can't judge that. If it goes bust, that's your problem. If it goes well and you make massive profits, good on you. But I want nothing to do with the risk. You wouldn't have that option under market socialism. You have to become a co-owner of that company, and then you're also exposed to the risk. And in the pure form, that would mean that your income also fluctuates wildly. Might be zero in some months if you don't have a profit in some months. So you'd have to, I guess, combine it then with a super extensive welfare state as well. Maybe a universal guaranteed basic income, and you still get the problem then. I've come across one author who sounds a bit similar to the one that you mentioned, the Nordic socialism guy. There was someone in the Bernie Sanders movement, the DSA movement, Democratic Socialists of America, Jacobin magazine, that crowd. He wrote a book called The Socialist Manifesto. Also describes a form of market socialism, doesn't call it that, but it sounds like that. Overlaps a bit, I guess, then with your author. So he gets around the whole problem of central planning. He says, well, that doesn't really apply to me because we still have markets and prices. But then he also talks about how there would not be a labor market anymore. And he says the state would allocate capital. There would be no capital market.
Exactly.
But if the state allocates capital, then that sounds like central planning again. Then you bring in central planning through the back door. You can say, oh no, it's not central planning when we do it. You just describe something that looks suspiciously like central planning, and that it would eventually then take over that economy. So whoever runs that state bank or whatever he would call that, that institution would effectively become a new planning board.
Yeah, I agree. Because if you have a situation, yeah, exactly. You have consumer markets and you have capital markets. And just to focus on consumer markets, say, well, we want a market economy, then we want prices. But then you don't have free capital markets. You wouldn't really call it a market. You have you have the state deciding which companies to invest in and which not, and how much. Then you de facto have state-run companies, because it would be inconceivable to extract money from taxpayers and give it to certain companies without any conditions or without any intervention. And also you would get situations where you have a company with, say, 10,000 employees, and they all have wealth in the company, and their job depends on it. And suddenly there's an international competitor that comes in, or a new technology. How would politicians react to that? They would protect the company, wouldn't they? I think it's inevitable that you see the consumption side of the economy being infected by the lack of capital markets.
Yes, you couldn't insulate it forever. And that there would also be the problem. What if you have capitalist companies coming from the outside? You said your guy is not in favor of autarky. He wants international markets. Okay, but what if it turns out that those foreign capitalists are just more efficient, and a lot of the internal, the domestic co-ops then go out of business because they can't compete with those superior conventional capitalist firms. They would then probably have to move to some form of border control and say, no, you're not getting in here because you're undercutting our worker co-ops, and we can't have that.
Yeah, because how do you create new ones?
Yeah, that's the problem. They can't even apply that to themselves. There is, I don't know if you've heard about this. There is a socialist magazine in the US called Current Affairs. The guy who founded it, Nathan Robinson, he also wrote. He is one of the media figures of this new socialist movement, and he also wrote a book about it. So one of those new socialist manifestos, and he created that magazine. And at some point, some of the people writing for him said they want democratic rights, so effectively turning it into a worker co-op. And he said, no, this is my baby. I created it. I took the risk. And then it caused a massive scandal because he, of course, said every company should be a worker co-op, but not mine. Leave me alone.
Yeah. And that's the point. It's very difficult to get new startup companies. Who should start them? Who's the entrepreneur? Who's the entrepreneur?
If everyone who's been working for you for a day has the same entitlement to the company as you, when you've been the original risk taker, you had the idea, you've been building it up from scratch, and you have no more of a claim over it than somebody who just comes along and says, okay, I want to make the coffee now for this company, and that person has as much of a voice as you have, then of course you wouldn't do it. And Nathan Robinson certainly would not have set up that magazine if he had known in advance that it would be that anyone who writes 2 articles for him would then have the same rights, the same say over the direction of the magazine as he had. So he was right for once that he resisted that. Yeah, I totally understand that.
Yeah. For once, yeah. So, do you have other examples of market socialist experiments?
No.
You mentioned Yugoslavia.
Yes, that was the only one so far. That's the problem. So they maybe have a stronger claim when a market socialist, when they say, well, it's been badly done, they have a stronger claim than a more conventional socialist, because if your idea fails 24 times and there's not a single positive example, then at some point you have a problem. If a market socialist said that, they would have a bit of a stronger claim. There I could imagine that somebody comes up with a halfway workable solution at some point. Would still run into all of the problems that we've discussed. I think such an economy would never be prosperous, and it would never be popular in practice either. I don't think most people would want to lead that kind of life where you have to be a co-entrepreneur. But I could imagine that to be at least not catastrophic. But it would also invalidate a lot of the promises that socialists make. You get some of the modern socialists who vaguely allude to market socialism, but who then also talk about democratizing the economy, all that kind of traditional socialist stuff. But then if you had a proper market socialist economy, then you can no longer make that argument. You can no longer claim that it's democratically run, because a market socialist economy isn't democratic. You still have companies making decisions. They may be internally democratic, but it's not that we, the people as a whole, or the working class as a whole, it's not that we make decisions about how our economy should be run. So there's one author from a university in Texas who talks a lot about, he says, look, we have all these large companies like Amazon. They make decisions to invest millions of dollars, and we, the workers, we have no say over this. Why shouldn't this be democratized in the way that he says that we moved to political democracy in the 18th, 19th century, doing away with monarchs and replace that with votes. Why don't we take the next step now and get rid of these economic monarchs? That's how he sees owners of private companies. A sort of mini monarchy, or well, not so mini, but in that sphere of life, and then we run things democratically. But then he also tries to get away from all the problems of central planning by saying, oh no, but you could still have markets, alluding to something like market socialism, saying we could still have prices, still have market mechanisms. Okay, but once you have that, you don't have a democratically run economy. So if you're a market socialist, you have to be honest about how you're not democratizing the economy. You can't come up with all these standard socialist claims. You then have to say quite honestly, yes, there will still be, there might then be, Amazon might then become a cooperative, but if you don't work for Amazon, you still have no say over what they do. And if they move in and if some high street booksellers then go bankrupt because Amazon is there, that could still happen under market socialism.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think that's what these market socialists, let's call them that, would be arguing, saying that, yeah, sure, but that's a given. We need markets to coordinate, but we want workers inside, the workers who donate all of their working time, a lot of effort to the company, should be deciding the fate of the company. I think that's the extent to which they would say this was a democratic, a sort of more democratic economy.
Yes.
I think that's the argument.
Yeah, the trouble is, I don't see many honest market socialists. I don't see many who also describe the downsides and limits of that. So far, a lot of socialists just sometimes allude to market socialism because they don't want to talk about central planning. So they'll say, oh no, we'll just do it in this way. We'll be market socialists of sort. But then also describe all the supposed advantages of a standard socialist economy. That you have planning on the basis of the needs of society as a whole, rather than just an individual company. But then that's not market socialism. If you're a proper market socialist, you have to drop all that rhetoric. You can't have it both ways. That's one of the problems with these people. We don't have consistent market socialists at the moment.
No. Yeah, great. That was a very, very interesting and not a planned detour, but a great. And I learned something. I need to think a little bit more about this. Let's return to the fully fledged socialist Marxist idea that is being revived also by this guy I told you about, Søren Maus, and many other people around the world right now. Marxism is on the rise, and the idea of socialism, full-fledged socialism without markets, is on the rise. Let's go through a few more of these economies and what socialists at the time said about the experiment. So when they were starting up, so they said about the Soviet Union. We haven't really come into that, but let's talk a little bit about that. The reaction to these, first the Soviet Union, and then you can go through some of the others. What's the pattern here?
Well, the pattern is a very straightforward one, and that is that nowadays, if you mention any of these examples to a modern day socialist, millennial socialist, democratic socialist, whatever, they'll all say that's got nothing to do with me. I'm a totally different type of socialist. I'm a democratic socialist, a 21st century socialist or whatever. But of course, that's easy to say once these examples have all been discredited and are seen to be failures, almost unanimously. But what I show in the book is that that argument, that's not really socialism, this sort of dismissal, that only comes after the event, once a socialist system has already been discredited. But if you look at what people said at the time when it seemed to be working, you get a very different pattern. The pattern is that whenever you have a socialist revolution somewhere in the world, within a couple of years, sometimes weeks, you have the first Western intellectuals arriving and saying, this is brilliant, they're building a new type of society, this is proper socialism, this time it's going to work. So then you get several years when Western intellectuals are praising that example to the skies. When nobody would say that's not really socialism. Then when in this initial phase, socialist systems are always very much in vogue with Western intellectuals. The Soviet Union was in the 30s, Maoism was in the 60s, early 70s, North Korea had its time in the 70s when it was popular. Nicaragua in the 1980s. Lots of Western backpackers.
And some of the people you mention in this book, that's true for Denmark as well. You don't quote Danish intellectuals, which is not so strange, but the people you mention in this book, they're not fringe. They're not fringe figures. I mean, you have Beatrice Webb, people like that. Talk a little bit about what types of people we're talking about.
Well, it's exactly that. It's always mainstream intellectuals. I'm deliberately not looking at people from mini communist parties. Of course, there might be one or two that slipped in, but that always exists. And that's not my focus, because that's not particularly interesting. You always get fringe groups, in the same way in which you get far right fringe groups who would idolize some military dictatorship, but that would be very much a fringe opinion. In the case of
or people thinking that a COVID vaccine has a tracking device in it, or whatever. You always have fringe people with strange ideas.
Of course,
but this is not fringe people.
Absolutely not. No, I deliberately ignore people that would be in the same league as the anti-vax movement. I'm looking at mainstream intellectuals, people who are established academics, journalists for mainstream papers, people who write best-selling books, and those are the sorts of people who do, or frontbench politicians sometimes. Those are the sorts of people who did historically glorify various socialist regimes. You had, you mentioned the Webbs. The Webbs were some of the biggest figures of the British left at the time.
So tell me who they were. Not me, but I know, but listeners.
They were the co-founders of the London School of Economics, of the New Statesman magazine, which is still around today, one of the biggest centre-left magazines in Britain, and of the Fabian Society, which is a sort of socialist think tank, used to be quite influential at times. They're also still around. It's always people like that, or George Bernard Shaw, who was a playwright, one of the most famous ones of that period. It's always mainstream artists, mainstream academics, mainstream journalists, and best-selling book authors who glorify these places. That's why Noam Chomsky is of course, mentioned several times in the book, because he's been at it for several decades. He's been part of this. He was one of the people who.
He's also a serial praiser, isn't he?
Yeah, he's a serial pilgrim. He was already doing this in the 70s when you had the Khmer Rouge in power in Cambodia, and there were some in the West who wrote. Was
he praising the Khmer Rouge? Noam Chomsky?
He wasn't actively praising them, but he just attacked everyone who talked about the Cambodian genocide. Whenever somebody talked about, tried to estimate the death figures, for example, or just describe the atrocities that happened, Chomsky would come after that person and would say this is cheap propaganda, and would try to discredit that person. And I would say, even if you don't actively praise a regime, if you go after everyone who criticizes it, de facto you have taken the side of that regime. So in that case, in the 70s, I would say that Chomsky did effectively side with the Khmer Rouge by trying to discredit their Western critics by saying this is all rubbish, these are all fabrications, these are all lies and propaganda. He didn't say that nobody was killed in Cambodia, but it was always he tried to downplay the figures, and of course some of it was anecdotes. It wasn't always well established, so he tried to undermine those claims by saying, well, but we don't really know, and anyone can say that, and don't believe it. So you would get the impression from reading Chomsky that yes, there were some bad things happening at the fringes, but that on the whole, that regime is pretty good, or at least okay, at least unfairly maligned. That's the impression that you would get, that this is a regime which makes some mistakes, but they're trying their best. So he doesn't literally say that they're great, and he doesn't literally endorse them, but downplays all the atrocities and goes after their critics.
Yeah, so, that's one of the most murderous regimes in history.
Absolutely. Yes.
So I mean, it's not. I know this is this is stereotype or whatever you call it, but it's akin to praising Mao or Hitler. It's or to sort of apologizing for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm not sure it was 6 million Jews. It might have been closer to 2 or something like that. It's akin to that, isn't it? I mean, it's just amazing that this guy isn't completely discredited. He's not.
No. That's one of the problems. They never are afterwards. They just sort of distance themselves from the regime after, or just stop talking about it altogether, and they just don't get called out. That's one of the problems. We had this then later again with Venezuela, where you had lots of mainstream politicians. You had Corbyn, who then became the leader of the Labour Party, of the main opposition party. He was hugely in favor of the Venezuelan regime. Several mainstream journalists who write for the big left-wing newspapers, The Guardian, The Independent, and you have those people writing articles for several years in a row saying this is wonderful, they're building a new type of society. And then when it goes downhill, when it collapses, they just suddenly stop talking about that issue altogether, and they don't get held to account. You never see the sort of interview where a presenter says, okay, here's what you wrote 3 years ago. Here's what you wrote 4 years ago. Where do you stand on that now? It's always those people would say, no, that's got nothing to do with me. I was never pro-Venezuela or never pro-Khmer Rouge, whatever the regime is. And they always seem to get away with it. But it is always the mainstream figures. That's the problem. This isn't some fringe phenomenon. It's sometimes very big figures.
So you mentioned Corbyn. Who else praised Venezuela?
On the British left, pretty much everyone. It's on the British socialist left. I mean, there's always the moderate.
Sure, I'm pretty sure Tony Blair didn't.
No, Tony Blair did not. No. It's always been that socialist wing. It's probably a different story in Denmark when you have a proportional representation system, that you'd have a mainstream social democratic party, and in those parties that doesn't happen. There's not a lot, at least not many Venezuela.
We have had some social democrats talk about Cuba being a samba socialism.
Okay,
samba is not even from Cuba, but there you go.
Yeah, that's the closest thing, maybe. That's something where even a social democrat might have some flirtations with it. But no, here it was figures. It was mainly people who later became the shadow cabinet of Corbyn. So the person who would have been his finance minister, the person who would have been his I don't know what exactly her position was. I think she would have been foreign minister. Pretty much his entire cabinet or shadow cabinet, they all used to praise Venezuela pretty much until a couple of days, in some cases, before he became Labour leader and before they became shadow cabinet, and also the big trade union leaders, all the general secretaries of the big trade unions. They all traveled to Venezuela, came back and said, brilliant.
Yeah. So they got that completely wrong, but they didn't only get that wrong. So it's not always the same people. So it's, you have to be a little bit careful that you're not sort of. We don't believe in collective guilt. We believe in individual individualism. So you can't just pull everyone on the left together and make them collectively guilty of everything that anyone has ever said about any regime, be it Cuba, North Korea, Cambodia, whatever. But what you describe in the book is a pattern of people on the left. Not always the same people. It's not. Chomsky is one of the examples of who got it wrong several different times, I believe. Isn't that correct? He did Cambodia, and he also praised Venezuela.
Yes, he then makes a comeback. He visited Venezuela in, I think, 2007 or so.
Yeah.
And said this. He did say, "You are creating a new socio-economic model here, and this could be transformative worldwide."
Yeah, exactly.
So that's why he really is a serial pilgrim.
Yeah. So you have some of those, but otherwise we need to be a little bit careful. But the pattern is striking, that you always have some people from the left saying, now this is real socialism as it's unfolding. And then so you describe some phases in that sort of Western debate about what's going on in a specific socialist experiment. Could you describe those phases to me?
Yes. So we've just talked about the first phase, the honeymoon phase. You've had the socialist revolution. It seems to be working for a while, in the case of Venezuela, because of the high oil prices. In the case of the Soviet Union, because of there was the initial industrialization. You always get a period when it seems to work okay. Yeah. And that's the honeymoon period when lots of Western intellectuals praise it. And you're right, it's not everyone, but I would still say there's hardly anyone who counters it. There may be those who don't actively praise it, but who don't speak out against it either. I haven't found many voices from, say, before 2013 or so, who actively criticize Venezuela. Which, if you're a socialist and all of your comrades are praising it, then maybe
I think, again, to the credit of this guy, he did praise Chavez, I think in 2006 or something like that. But if I remember correctly, it was in 2011 that he said goodbye Chavez, and that's because he sensed that it was turning into an autocratic thing, a cult of personality. So that's pretty good. But that, he still got it wrong in the first. Yeah, but he's a decent bloke, but he just gets it wrong.
No, that 2011 would be as good as it gets. I couldn't think of any of the British ones who, by that time, had moved past Chavez already. What happens then? You get
I think it was 11. I'll check it out. Yeah.
Well, if so, that would be pretty good. Here, the first ones. Here, it wasn't until 2014 or so when the crisis had already started. That's always the thing. You always get some crisis or some bad stuff that is already happening, but it's just not that well known in the West. And then it does become more widely known, and the reputation of that system suffers. In the Soviet Union, it was because we Westerners just learned gradually about the gulags and the show trials. It just became more widely known that that was a dystopian hellhole. And in the case of Venezuela, it turned around when they had this crash in 2014 because oil prices had dropped, and that's when socialists stopped with their very active, naive praise, and then look for excuses for a while. In the case of Venezuela, there was just a period of silence. Suddenly, the country had dropped off the map. You had before then, you had articles in the mainstream press praising Venezuela. In the Independent would run articles on that. And then once the crisis hit, it was just suddenly no longer there. And then a couple of years later, you get the same people who were actively praising it now saying, that's not socialism. That was never socialism. And it is sometimes
the very same people who said, this is great, this is socialism, come out later and say that was never socialism.
Doesn't have to be the same people always. In the case of Venezuela, yes, there you absolutely get some people who are on record for saying this is socialism, who later said this is not socialism. In that case, yes, it is. In some cases, the same people. In earlier examples, it was more that you just had a new generation of socialists growing up. Let's say if you were a student in the late 1960s, then you wouldn't remember this phase of Soviet euphoria of the 30s. That would be something that would be the previous generation.
Yeah, that's a long time ago. Yeah,
exactly. So there it wouldn't be literally the same people. It would just be you have a new generation of socialists. They're not emotionally invested in the projects of 10, 20 years ago. So for them, it's then quite easy to say, oh no, but that's not socialism. We want something totally different. And that was usually the way it worked. And this does now happen with Venezuela as well, that you get younger ones who genuinely don't have that memory. Let's say somebody who is in their early 20s today. That would mean that the collapse of Venezuela would have happened at the time when they were still teenagers. And if you become interested in socialist ideas after that, you would just not develop much of an attachment to Venezuela. You would just right from the start see that as a failed example. But that doesn't mean that these people are somehow a different kind of socialists. It's just that they have no memories of the phase when Venezuela was the new hope.
Right.
And, so you sometimes get this conflict. This did happen with the Socialist Party of Germany, the Die Linke. They had a party conference once where there were some people storming the stage with banners praising Maduro, praising Venezuela. And then you had people from the youth organization distancing themselves from that, saying, this is a more old-fashioned type of socialist. We've got nothing to do with that. That's these old guys, that they think like that. We're different. But the thing is, these were all people in their early 20s. They simply didn't have the memory of the time when Venezuela seemed to represent a new hope. And because when that happened, when Venezuela became a big thing in the mid-2000s, it was the same rhetoric. They would all say, this is so totally different from the Soviet Union. That's what makes it so great. And it's this great hope of a new beginning. That was there right from the start, the same mindset. The only difference between the socialists who still cling to Venezuela and the ones that don't is that the ones that don't are just too young to remember it. The ones who are a bit older, maybe they became socialists at the time when Venezuela was the big thing. They developed an emotional attachment and now they can't let go.
Okay. How about Mao's China?
Yeah, that was that was the thing where if you ask anyone who went to university in a Western country in the late 60s, they will all talk about how the Mao fashion, how that was part of student life. People wearing Mao badges, waving Mao's little red book, and how those were fashion items as much as symbols of an ideology. You had lots of the student activists, the more famous ones in West Germany in particular, and France, the Rudi Dutschke, those sorts of people were hugely in favor of Maoist China. And those were those people, their argument was that this is totally different from the Soviet Union. And that's what made it so attractive, which they could, because at that time, initially, China and the Soviet Union were allies. But then came the so-called Sino-Soviet split. They drifted apart, hated each other, and that made it easier for Western socialists to say, look, then they're not friends. And that's because the Chinese, they're building a totally different kind of socialism, and that's the real thing. And so this is what happened in the 60s, that you had, oddly enough, you had people who saw themselves as rebellious and countercultural, would somehow project those ideas into China, which was one of the most horrendously authoritarian societies in the world. The 1968 students, they thought they were oppressed because their parents told them to turn down the rock music. But in China, they would have been sent to a labor camp. But they somehow thought China was this sort of libertine paradise. But it was, in that case, it wasn't just the established intellectuals, not just the established professors, although them too, but also there was the student movement that was glorifying Maoist China from afar. But it was also some of the well-established, all the famous French philosophers from that period, like Simone de Beauvoir. They're all on record for talking about how wonderful this all is.
Yeah. Okay. So in the second phase, where they sort of need to explain away what's going on, you describe in the book how you also get to some very cynical considerations, at least in some of the cases. With the Soviet Union, it's very clear. I don't know, I can't remember the extent to which this carries on into the other later examples. Some cynical, sort of cost-benefit analysis. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs, and the revolution is so important that it doesn't matter that a few million people are killed. That type of thing. I mean, you have some quotes of people actually writing stuff like that.
Yes,
it's amazing.
Yes, that's a typical rhetoric of the second phase, where you get. That's already there even during the honeymoon phase. You always get the naive ones who just project all their fantasies into the socialist system of today, and you get the more hard-nosed ones who have a slightly more realistic idea and who are still in favor of it. I think this phrase with the omelette, I think that was made still during the heyday when Soviet socialism, Stalinism was still very popular. This was just a guy who knew more about it, because he literally lived in Moscow at the time. He was the foreign correspondent of I think the New York Times, Walter Duranty, and he saw the show trials and the mass arrests all the time, and so he couldn't possibly say this is a romantic workers' paradise. So he came up with this quite different rhetoric of saying, yes, this is quite brutal, but it's still worth it.
Yeah, because it will be a romantic workers' paradise at some point. And until then, all the individuals who stand in the way will just have to end up on a show trial in Siberia.
Yes. Yeah. And that becomes more typical in the second phase, that when the initial dreams of a romantic paradise are shattered, you get people who just cannot let go, and who therefore start making justifications for atrocities that happen. And we saw that again with Venezuela many decades later, where you also had people. I mean, this started in the beginning. You had newer socialist magazines like Jacobin in the US, Jacobin magazine, where they would write about how Venezuela is a kind of nice romantic socialism. And then it became clear that it was actually turning into a fairly grim police state, especially after Chavez had died and in the Maduro years. And you just get people who are emotionally invested in this project, can't let go, and they're looking for excuses. They're looking for a reason to believe that the revolution is still a noble project, and the reason why they suffer is just that there is just something bad going on.
All prices have come down. It's there's a crisis right now because oil prices have come down. I've been in that discussion with people, with Danish socialists.
Yes.
No, it's just because oil prices went down. Well, oil prices went down all over the world. They went down in Norway as well. They produce oil. They went down in the US. They produce oil, but they didn't turn into an economic basket case.
Yeah, well, it's in general, it's a strange argument to make that you can't blame them because oil prices have come down. I mean, most systems never had any. Most countries in the world never had any oil to begin with. So even if oil prices were lower, they still had some oil. They still had something which they could sell on the world market very easily, even if no longer at these astronomical prices, but they still could make money out of it. And there's lots of countries in the world which would have loved to have that opportunity to sell oil, even if it's at slightly lower prices than at the peak, or for that matter, for the presidents before Chavez. It was just an anomaly that for this 12-year or so period, oil prices were so high. That was the anomaly. You can't then.
And Chavez financed his economic experiment with that, and it went on probably for much longer than it could have if it hadn't been for that. Those very high oil prices. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it would have collapsed much sooner.
Yeah.
It was that was what bailed him out.
Yeah. And then we get to the phase to the phase where they realize that this is a failed experiment, and then you get the story that this was never socialism.
Yeah. But before that, can I just for a second go back to the second phase?
Yeah.
Because you mentioned the Durantes that can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. You also get that in other regimes. That's when that's why I mentioned Jacobin. They are normally the sort of romantic socialists. They would not endorse Stalinism. They're the sort of millennial hipster socialists. Set up many decades, of course, after all that. So the people who write for them have no memory of the Cold War. They wouldn't praise Stalin. But you still see the same psychological mechanism. They had one guy who wrote a book about Chavez in the early or mid years when he was still at the height of his popularity, developed this emotional attachment to Venezuelan socialism. And then suddenly when it went downhill, that guy was looking for excuses and found the excuse, of course, that it was saboteurs. And wanted to believe that.
The good old saboteurs.
Yes, that's the recurring theme, and you get that then in the second phase. And that's why this hipster socialist magazine, Jacobin, who would recoil with horror if you called them Stalinists, you had people writing for them who talked about saboteurs in Venezuela, and that's very much a Stalinist rhetoric. But there you can see where that came from in the 30s and 40s, where you had people making excuses for that. They had this emotional attachment to the Soviet Union. They just wanted to believe that if there's something going wrong, it must be the saboteurs. And you had then people in just a few years ago, saying, making similar arguments about Venezuela, saying, no, Maduro is absolutely justified cracking down on these protesters. They are the ones undermining the economy. They're the saboteurs, and they are the enemies of the working class. And that's the irony. These are people who would previously have said, Stalinism has nothing to do with us, sounding exactly like a copy of the Prada from the 1930s, because it was now an example, the socialist system that they had an emotional attachment to.
Yeah, yeah. So in a sense, if you, this is maybe a little bit condescending, but if you view it as kind of a religious cult, it's sort of self-containing in a sense. You can protect your ideology by always claiming that if something goes wrong, you also have that point at the end of the book very eloquently explained that if it goes wrong, by definition it isn't socialism, because socialism is characterized by not going wrong.
Yes,
obviously, because it is well intentioned. And so that's how you protect it in sort of from looking at each of these 25 experiments and reaching the conclusion there's something endemic here. But you also get it, in each individual case when you look at something going wrong, you say, well, there's always somebody who's the bad guy. It's never socialism that's the bad guy. Mm-hmm. It's a saboteur, or it's oil prices that's gone down. You always got these explanations because socialism by definition can't fail.
Yes. Yeah, it would be like saying a rain dance is a dance that produces rain. And therefore, if you dance around and it doesn't rain afterwards, then it cannot have been a rain dance. You just bake the fact that it's supposed to work into your definition, and then by definition you can't fail. If you define your preferred system in such a way that it must produce wonderful outcomes, then every system that doesn't produce these outcomes is then by definition it cannot have been your system. That's the mistake that socialists make. They say a proper socialism is democratic and run by the workers, and that's what they aspire to. But what if that can't be done? What if that's just an unrealistic aspiration? But for a proper socialist, it can never be disproven, because once it becomes clear that it isn't a worker democracy, because it never is and can't be, then they will just say, but the original vision was a workers' democracy. So they see that as something that you can simply introduce. And if you don't introduce that, then it must be because you never wanted to.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's be a little bit self-critical here, because I think that to some extent you could make the same accusation against us free market guys, that whenever we see something we don't like in a market economy, we say, well, that's not capitalism. Crony capitalism. That's crony capitalism. That's not real capitalism. If only we do things the right way, then that wouldn't happen. If we're giving subsidies to agriculture and to all kinds of businesses, but that's not capitalism. That you're not supposed to do that. We bail out banks, we bail out companies. Well, that's not capitalism. But I guess socialists could say, well, that's all very fine with you, but the fact of the matter is that this always happens in a capitalist system, because capitalism is based on democracy and lobbyism, and lobbyism works, and special interests. You have dispersed costs and concentrated benefits, as described by Mansur Olson and other public choice people. We can link to some of that in show notes. We don't have time to get into it here. So that is a built-in failure in the capitalist system. So you have to own it. What would you say to that criticism?
There is some truth in that. First of all, if you apply that to the most purist libertarian, there I would say, yes, this does apply. It's just that in our case, that absolute purist, that's maybe 3 people. For the socialists, that's pretty much the entire movement. Otherwise, there's a difference in degree. A capitalist who says, but that's crony capitalism, would not say Therefore, this system has absolutely nothing to do with me. A capitalist or a liberal would say, this is not ideal capitalism, but it comes somewhat close to the system I want, which is different from this has nothing to do with me. So you're still owning it. You're still saying...
and we want to reform it. We want to get rid of the sugar subsidy. And yes, we can actually argue for individual steps, incremental steps that would move us in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
And even with the crony stuff, the system actually kind of works, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
We don't need to be on 10 on the economic freedom scale.
Yeah.
To be a wealthy, well-functioning society. We can actually be at 9 or 8 or even at 7 or 6 and do much better than the countries which are at 2 or 3 at the economic freedom scale.
Yeah, that's always been the argument, that there is just this positive correlation. If you move up the economic freedom scale, lots of outcomes get better. But that's very different from what a socialist would say. They wouldn't say...
They would say when we get to 0 in economic freedom, suddenly we will spike up in wealth.
Something like that, yeah. But they wouldn't accept approximations. It's either heaven or hell, and if it's not completely pure, then they would say this tells us absolutely nothing about socialism. They wouldn't accept the second best solution, the approximation, where we can point to the Hong Kongs and Singapores of this world, or Switzerland, and say this is the closest thing. Socialists couldn't do that. They would purely describe entirely hypothetical societies, or just these very short-lived, romanticized experiments, just the Paris communes.
Yeah. Okay. So we've been going on a long time. Are you happy to just wrap it up in 5 more minutes? Is that okay?
Yes, sure.
Okay, sure. Because I want to deal with one more issue with you, and that is, why do socialist ideas persist? You know, we've been giving them a hard time here, and we think we have pretty good arguments for it, and the empirical evidence is overwhelming. The theoretical arguments are strong, but still here we are. Why does socialism, the idea of socialism, as you say in the title of your book, why does the idea never die?
Yeah, that part of the book, I admit, is a bit speculative. There I go into evolutionary psychology, not something I'd claim to be an expert on. But I think it is quite well established that a lot of our moral intuitions have evolutionary explanations. We feel about things a certain way, that something feels wrong, something feels right, because it once made sense to feel that way. In a hunter-gatherer, caveman society, the reason why most of us are quite conformist, why we don't want to be the only one with a dissenting opinion, is that well, those among our ancestors who didn't have that instinct of wanting to fit in, they were thrown out of the group and they were eaten by the wolves. So therefore we are the descendants of the ones that do want to fit in with the group. And that's where conformism comes from, has evolutionary explanations. And I think in the same way, a lot of our moral intuitions about economic life have prehistoric evolutionary explanations. It just feels wrong when someone has a lot more money than someone else, and we can't really explain why. And it just.
Well, I can explain why.
Well, okay, that's an acquired taste.
But I think even if people can explain why, I think some people would still consider it wrong, because they. Oh no, I see what you mean. If you explain why, then you realize it's not zero sum. But I guess, you know, in a hunter-gathering society, if somebody has a lot more than someone else, the assumption would be that someone else would have lost that to, you know, if you go out hunting and you get a lot of meat, back, someone else will go out in the forest and there's less meat for that person.
Yes.
Or if you get much of the land, if you get to agricultural society, that's at the expense of somebody else who gets less land.
Mm-hmm.
But now we're in a society of ideas, and it's a completely different ballgame. If you create a lot of value, it's not zero sum.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's
zero sum economics.
And that is counterintuitive from an evolutionary psychology perspective.
Exactly, zero sum thinking is very much something that must have evolutionary roots, because it was just true for hundreds of thousands of years that the world was a zero sum game, and it was true the whole time. And nowadays, if you ask someone, do you literally believe that one person's gain must always be somebody else's loss? Most people would not say, most people would of course say no. If you ask directly like that, most people would realize you can actually have mutual beneficial mutual gains. You can have everyone being better off, but we still often talk about economic outcomes as if we believed in zero-sum economics. So we may say, yes, I understand it's possible for several parties to all be better off at the same time, but it's still somehow, the intuition is still quite zero-sum. And it's also true in the hunter-gatherer society that if one person ends up with a lot more, it's not just that that somebody else must have less. It's also the act. How did that happen? There must be something wrong about that. In that case, it's probably because that was the person who is just physically strongest and took it away by force. So there's something morally wrong about that. You want to restrain a person like that, and it would just then be somebody would have made that decision consciously that somebody should have more than others, whereas in a market economy it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. So even if you think about it, you realize that that's not the case. The fact that the intuition is that before you start sort of thinking about it, the intuition is this has got to be wrong. That affects people's general thinking. So
yes.
So that's a Jonathan Haidt argument, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Could you say a little bit about that?
Well, Haidt makes the more general case that most political reasoning is just a justification for an intuition. So you may think that you hold a particular belief X for reason Y, but then if somebody demolishes argument Y, you will probably still want to believe X. So the causation is more the other way around. You have the intuition first, and then you look for reasons to justify it. But if somebody destroys those reasons, if they all turn out to be wrong, that doesn't mean that you will change your mind. You will probably just look for other reasons to justify the same thing. And therefore, that's why political arguments are often extremely frustrating. That somebody says, I've got this on Twitter literally every day, that somebody says, if we did not have the National Health Service, if we didn't have a state-run health system, you would literally have people dying in the streets, and it would all be horrible. And then I showed them, no, there are market-based systems in the world. There is the system in the Netherlands. That's a market-based healthcare system. There's a system in Switzerland. It's a market-based healthcare system. Nobody dies in the streets. The poor are still covered by that system. They actually have better survival rates than we have. I've got all the figures. That's not the issue. But do I convince people with that? No, they would then just look for some other reason. And that clearly shows the intuition is there first. They just feel good about this system and just look for ways to justify it. You can destroy the argument, but that doesn't change the person's mind.
And that brings us to Kaplan and rational irrationality.
Mm-hmm. Yes, there the argument is that, well, he says it's wrong to think that beliefs are just a means to an end, at least in politics. I mean, in the non-political sphere, that's generally true. For example, I believe that this program on which we're recording this is probably the best there is. But if you showed me good evidence that there's a different program which is better for recording, I would change my mind, because it's not something that I feel very protective about.
And it also affects you very directly. You know, if I believed a certain product tasted better than another product, and then I taste the other product and I actually prefer that, you know, it would bring, if I kept sort of stubbornly to my previous idea, it would come at a cost. I'd be eating something I didn't like as much as something else, and that's irrational.
Yes, exactly. But
you wouldn't do that. But when it comes to politics, it's not.
An irrational political belief doesn't directly affect you. You can be wrong about everything and still be very prosperous, because you don't directly suffer from the consequences of your erroneous beliefs when it's in politics. Of course, if you believe, for example, that protectionism makes the country richer, and if everyone believes that, and somebody then imposes protectionism, and then yes, you will be poorer as a result. But it would still not be because you individually hold that belief. It will be because the majority hold that belief.
And you changing your opinion wouldn't make any difference at all.
Yeah, that's why I once had this idea. Ideally, there should be some sort of simulation where everyone's living standards depend on their individual political beliefs. So everyone lives.
Kristian, that is.
I don't know how exactly it will work, but the basic idea is that you live as if your ideas were enacted, as if they were actual policy. So that means if you're a communist, you eat tree bark, then you're miserable. The moment you realize that maybe property rights are okay, suddenly you're clothed and you have some basic food. And if you then advance even further and think maybe Swiss-style capitalism is the best, then you live like a king. But it's all directly in proportion to the ideas that you hold. It's all as if your ideas were political practice, but they only affect you.
I think that's a funny little experiment, but I think the serious point at the end of that is, and something we really need to think about, and something that worries me a lot, is the more things in society you turn into political issues, the more rational irrationality you're going to get.
Yes, absolutely.
So if the more stuff you have in the civil society, in the family, in the marketplace, the more people are directly relate to their beliefs and decisions, and it has consequences. And the more you turn it into politics, the more it is a free lunch for the individual to be irrational. And so you create a society where people become more and more irrational. And I have a suspicion that is part of the reason why we see this polarization of the debate. That more and more, you know, as the state grows, as regulation grows, more and more turns into political issues, and more and more discussions become these discussions you're talking about on Twitter, where we're shouting at each other, but we're not listening. Whereas the debates that we have in the marketplace are, I mean, we're not completely rational, but we're a lot more rational. We're listening a little bit more carefully, and we're willing to change our minds, and we cooperate and we get closer to each other. Whereas as soon as it turns into politics, it's the polarization.
Yeah, that's the problem, because in a market, we can have separate beliefs, and if you think this product is is better and I prefer a different one, then you can buy your product and I can buy mine. I don't have to convince you. It doesn't affect me if I think that you're wrong. Whereas if we have to agree on a policy, then of course it gets more vicious. Then it's suddenly no longer let's just agree to disagree, because only one of us can win, and whoever wins imposes their ideas on the other guy. So
and you get that crazy situation. One of the places where it's most obvious is where you have, all not all, but virtually all Democrats in the US having one idea about whether masks work or not, and you have all Republicans with the opposite belief. That's crazy. That's really, really scary.
That's the hyper-tribalism, yes.
Yeah.
And politics as identity, that you can tell from the type of shops that there are in an area. You can tell what political leanings they have, because if you're a left-wing voter, you're more likely to go to independent coffee shops or whatever, and that it all becomes wrapped up in someone's sense of self and lifestyle and who you are.
Yeah, we don't want that.
Absolutely not.
Kristian Niemietz, it was great talking to you about your book. It's called Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. We will link to it in show notes. Is there anything you want to add at the end of the conversation? No,
I think I've been rambling on for too long already anyway.
It's been a conversation. I've been saying as much as you, I think. And I learned a lot from the conversation. I need to think a little bit more about market socialism. I have been thinking a bit about it while we're talking, and I think it will spiral towards the same kind of outcome, because capital markets are not free. But maybe we should have a different conversation about that at some point. Kristian, thank you very much for being part of my podcast.
Oh, thanks for the invitation.